Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining our virtual event today. My name is Deng, and I'm a research associate here at the Public Policy Institute of California. My co-author, Laura Hill, and I are excited to share findings from our recent report, Adapting to Changes in California's English Learner Population. Our report, technical appendices, policy brief, and slides from today's briefing can all be found at our website at ppic.org. This research and event are supported from funding from the Sobrato Family Foundation, so we'd like to thank them for their support. For today's program, I will be presenting some of our main findings and later be joined by my co-author, Laura Hill, to discuss key takeaways and answer any audience questions. Now, if you do have a question, please send it along with your name and organization to the following address, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. And just as a reminder, PPIC is a nonpartisan nonprofit organization. We do not take or support positions on any ballot measure or on any local, state, or federal legislation, nor do we support, endorse, or oppose any political parties or candidates for public office. Okay, so let's get started and talk about English learners. So to give us some background and motivations for this project, I want to start with some basic key facts about the multilingual and English learner population here in California. So in the 2023-24 school year, close to 40% of all TK through 12 students spoke a language other than English at home. Now, the majority of these multilingual students are Spanish speakers, but there has slowly been a growing proportion of Mandarin, Arabic, and Russian speakers in the state. Now, not all multilingual students, though, will be classified as English learners. And this is based on, first, their responses to a home language survey and the results of an initial assessment exam that they take at the start of school entry. So in fact, roughly a third of public school students are either current or former English learners. And you'll hear me refer to this particular group as ever English learners or ever ELs for the rest of the presentation. So the ever English learner enrollment has fallen by almost 450,000 students over the past decade. And since the 2015-16 school year, total enrollment has fallen by around 6%, as indicated by this gray dashed line. But as you can see, the drops among ever ELs in the bottom orange has largely driven these overall enrollment declines in California. And compared to the trends for English-only students in the Navy, they had a slight dip during the pandemic, but their enrollments have since rebounded. The declines for ever ELs had a harder hit during the pandemic and is now about 15% lower than their enrollments in 2015. And we estimate that the declines in the ever EL population explain about 96% of the overall K through 12 enrollment decline in California. And some of our previous work here at PPIC shows that these declines among ever ELs are largely driven by declining birth rates, especially among Latina women, as well as outmigration from California. Now, these declining enrollment trends lead us to our main research questions in our report. So first, we ask, how has the English learner population changed over the last decade or so, both in terms of size as well as composition? Next, we turn to reclassification, and we try to understand how these trends were impacted from the disruptions to learning and instruction during the pandemic. And when we talk about reclassification, we talk about the point in which an English learner transitions out of their English language development courses into the traditional academic trajectory. And finally, given these enrollment shifts, we ask, what are the implications of these changes on English learner services, program offerings, and their learning trajectories? And we draw on interviews with school districts and include some of their quotes in today's presentation. Now, as you've seen in the previous figure, enrollments for ever ELs have been declining statewide, but this is not uniform across the state. And so as I know this is a funky figure, but this is a weighted map of California based on school district enrollment. So you'll see that larger districts, such as Los Angeles Unified, are represented physically bigger in this map. But if we just pay attention to just the color scheming, we can see that there are a handful of districts that did experience ever English learner growth over this last period, as indicated by these pockets of green. So about a third of all districts had this growth, mainly in the Central Valley, Northern, and Sierra Foothill communities. And of the largest 10 school districts in California, only Elk Grove and San Juan Unified both in the Sacramento region, had enrollment growth since 2015. But when we wait for district enrollment, it's clear that the majority of the state is experiencing these enrollment declines, as represented by the majority red shading. And so you'll see that the greatest declines are in these large coastal districts, such as Los Angeles and San Diego, Long Beach Unified, and San Francisco Unified. And from our interviews with districts, some have indicated that their English learner composition is also changing. And in particular, there have been changes to their newcomer population, less so in terms of counts, but rather in terms of country of origin. So some districts have noticed that they're seeing more students come from countries in Central America, such as El Salvador and Guatemala. And most of these newcomers are often arriving at the secondary level. And they've often had very significant educational disruptions, including some time spent in refugee camps. And so, as one of the districts had said to us, we're getting a lot more students with interrupted formal education. They skip a few grades, they have really low literacy in their home language, and they have very underdeveloped academic skills. So, that's been a huge adjustment to try to figure out. And so later we'll talk about how these districts are trying to adapt to these shifts and also the challenges that arise for them, especially when it comes to changes in their programming. Next, we're going to pivot and address our second research question, which is how reclassification trends have changed, especially after the pandemic interrupted the process of identifying English learners and reclassifying them at a timely manner. And again, here, reclassification refers to that point in time in which an English learner transitions out of their traditional ELD courses and into the regular academic curriculum that English-only students take. Now, California's annual reclassification rate has usually hovered around 13 to 14% in the years leading up to the pandemic. And then reclassification definitely took a hit during the pandemic and fell to around 7% in 2020. Now, since then, the California Department of Education has unfortunately stopped publicly reporting the statewide reclassification rate, which has made it difficult to understand what the trends for reclassification are post-pandemic. But as part of our report, we're able to estimate what the reclassification rate would have been by using a method by tracking synthetic cohorts over time. And so we estimate that in 2021, the reclassification rate still remained low, around 6%, until it began increasing again in 2022 and reached pre-pandemic levels in 2023. Now, this is one of my favorite graphs in the report because it shows how these declines in reclassification rates ended up flattening cumulative growth in reclassification, especially for the 2015 to 2018 kindergarten cohorts that had students in the second to fifth grade that were especially impacted during the pandemic. So let's break this down. So as you can see that prior to the pandemic, the cumulative proportion of ELs who are becoming reclassified is growing pretty steadily. And so if we follow this 2015 top orange cohort, you'll see that by the fourth grade, almost 40% of English learners were reclassified. And then as you can see by fifth grade, since reclassification rates had fallen, you can see that this line is starting to flatten a bit. And so cumulative growth is slowing down. And because of the slowdown, only about 60% of the initial 2015 kindergarten cohort had been reclassified by the start of eighth grade in 2023. Now, even if we just compare the 2015 and the 2018 cohorts, the 2018 cohort, they had younger students who were especially impacted during the pandemic. You'll see that only about 20% of the 2018 cohort was reclassified by the start of fourth grade, compared to that 40% in the earlier 2015 cohort. So this means that there's now a lot of catching up to do for districts to get their English learners reclassified. And later on in our discussion, we'll spend some time talking about how these delays have impacted long-term English learners and what the best ways to address their needs are. Now, given these critical changes to the English learner population in terms of their size, composition, and learning pathways, we did talk to a few district officials and EL program officers to understand what the possible implications of these changes are on districts. And one main impact of the EL changes is influencing how districts are thinking about programming and staffing, right? As I mentioned earlier, with the influx of newcomer students, some districts are now trying to implement specific newcomer programs to help students become acquainted with the American educational system while also helping them with, intensive English language and literacy development. And then other schools are deliberately trying to pair their newcomer students with their reclassified students in order to give them some mentorship throughout their education. Now, newcomer programs are just one example of a bilingual program, and one that you might often hear when we talk about bilingual programs and in this types of conversations is the dual language immersion program, or the DLI program. And these are growing in popularity because of the long-term benefits of bilingualism on academic and employment outcomes in the future. And these programs usually consist of 50% native speakers in a language other than English, as well as 50% native English speakers. But still, bilingual programs are not yet prevalent in most schools. Only about 13% of all schools offer a bilingual program. And when it comes to DLI programs, some of the districts that we spoke to indicated that there was first unequal demand in these types of programs, as well as a shortage of staff to supply these programs to their students. So as one district had said, it continues to be a struggle to get our Spanish-speaking students into the dual language immersion program, while we have a waiting list for our English-only students. So it's about changing those mindsets of our Spanish-speaking parents to understand that if your child can have this support, they will learn English faster and they will learn the academics at the same time. Another district had said, we also struggled with being able to staff schools with teachers that are meeting the requirements of Spanish-speaking instruction. So we've had to form combo classes, meaning the teacher is teaching two different grade levels in a dual language immersion within one classroom. So this puts a lot of pressure on the current batch of teachers and incoming ones to get the certifications needed to teach a bilingual program. And in the report, we mentioned that the state has set goals to increase their multilingual programming and improve biliteracy. And this is all part of an initiative called Global California 2030. And it states that by 2030, half of all students should participate in programs leading to proficiency in two or more languages. And by 2040, 3/4 of all students should be proficient in at least two languages, earning them the state seal of biliteracy. Now, part of these goals also include having 100 state-approved bilingual teacher preparation programs, as well as 2,000 new bilingual teacher authorizations per year. Currently, we only have about half the number of state-approved bilingual programs, as well as 70% of those teacher authorizations per year. However, still only 1% of all students have received the state seal of biliteracy. So that means there's still some work to be done in order to reach that goal in 2030. Another potential impact is how translation services are affected at schools. So current law in California mandates that if 15% or more of a school's population speaks a certain language other than English at home, then that school must offer translation services for any notices, reports, or documents that are sent to families. But if enrollments among English learners is declining, this might mean that some students are now attending schools where their language subpopulation are not meeting that 15% threshold. And we see that over time, the share of these students who are isolated at these schools without translation services has increased by about 5 percentage points over the last decade. And for Spanish, the main language in the state, the share of Spanish-speaking students who are isolated did tick up about 2 percentage points from 6.6% to 8.4%. Now, given these changes to the EL population and the potential impacts that might arise, our report concludes with some policy considerations to help districts better understand and handle and adapt to these changes. And so as we saw with the lags in reclassification and the fact that policies around reclassification may vary across districts, it's really important to standardize reclassification and automate decisions throughout the year in hopes that this might help catch up that cumulative reclassified rate for those kindergarten cohorts that were especially impacted during the pandemic. Second, it's crucial to graduate and train teachers to meet this growing demand for dual language immersion programs, especially since the state is pushing for stronger biliteracy in general. The teacher staffing problem will be a main driver in helping the state realize its goals. And then finally, it's important for districts to have conversations with families, right? Being an English learner not only involves just the student, but also a wide support network that includes the student's family. And especially when we see, for instance, how Spanish-speaking families might be unaware of the certain benefits of certain programming for their children, it's really important to educate EL families and even attune to any concerns that they might have about any stigma that might come up with being identified as an English learner. Now, these are just some broader policy considerations to think about, but now I'd like to turn over to a discussion with my colleague, Laura Hill, to discuss some of these more specific topics that are important to consider. And again, if you do have any questions, please send them along with your name and organization to ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. Yeah, so Laura, I think to start us off, one thing that I didn't have enough time to discuss at length was the role of identification of English learner status when children start at school. I had mentioned that students are first identified by how families respond to that home language survey taken at the start of school entry. And dependent on that, students might also take an initial assessment exam to determine whether they're classified as an English learner. But maybe you can talk a little bit more about what are some of the more recent policies or changes that are affecting how English learner students are being identified.
That's a great topic. I'd love to dig in on that. Thanks, Beyond, and thanks for your presentation. Yeah, the home language survey, which you mentioned, is the first step that really every student in the state experiences when their families are getting ready to enroll a child in the system, are asked a series of questions about what languages they speak at home and to what extent they don't speak English at home. And that is really the pre-screener for deciding which children then take an assessment. And we'd heard even before this report, certainly anecdotal evidence that some families are not interested in having their child identified as an English learner, so they might not answer that question as accurately as we would hope. And that can lead to some challenges later on down the line if the child turns up at school and actually does need supportive services. So that's been something that's been going on. But we heard something a little new this year, which is that some school districts are finding parents don't want to answer non-English languages being used at home because they're concerned about the immigration climate. And I think that's something that that schools and districts are gonna need to be grappling with and helping families understand what the purpose of the home language survey is, where the information lives, why it's done, and how answering questions accurately will be hopefully helpful to their child in the end. And so I think along the lines that Beyond was just mentioning when it comes to explaining the benefits of bilingual programming. There might be some work that can be done around this same time, explaining just the general benefits of participating and answering these questions as best as you can so that students get the services that they may need. So that's one thing that we heard about. Another major thing that's going on when it comes to identification right now is both the expansion of TK and how we are, and that's transitional kindergarten, and how we are identifying English learners. It used to be up until this school year that ended in May that the same rules applied. If you started in TK, the home language survey started off the process to determine if your child was given an assessment or not. And assessments were being given to 4-year-olds as a part of just starting school. And there's some concern that that assessment might be over-identifying English learner students. So there's legislation that ended that use of the assessment in the last school year. But what that means is last school year, there was no formal identification of transitional kindergartners who might be dual language learners or English learners. So you can see that in the data for this most recent school year. There are a lot of TK kids who we don't know if they're English learners or not. And then going forward, there is work being done to come up with an assessment that can be appropriately used for 4-year-olds. But when talking to districts, they acknowledge this as an issue, but also said that the TK classroom environment is just such a language-rich place that many of them were not actually particularly concerned that they did not have this tool at their disposal, that they felt like they were able to, on the fly identify the children that needed extra support, and that a lot of that was happening in the classroom as it was already. So this will be changing in the future, but this is where we are right now with no identification, and many TK instructors and English learner folks feeling like this is working for them right now. The final thing is a policy that's changing this year that I think is important for our younger English learners and identification, and that is moving towards a reading screener that will be given to all K through 2 students. Some districts piloted this last year. All of them are going to be using it this coming year. And the idea is that it will make it easier for the teachers of young children to understand what is just a traditional sort of expected challenge with learning to read versus something that might require more intensive intervention. And this could be particularly useful for English learner students when they're both trying to learn English overall, like all parts of it, oral and reading and speaking, versus, something that could be later determined to require more intensive services related to a learning difference, for example. So I've talked a lot about the early part of identification and the or English learner's child's trajectory in the system and beyond. I know you had signaled to us there's a little bit more to hear about the students that remain English learners for a little bit longer, and love to pass it off to you to hear more about that.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, the pandemic led to many delays in students being reclassified. And so that made us wonder how this might have also impacted students who we call at risk. So these are students who are English learners for 4 to 5 years, as well as long-term English learners. And these are students who have been English learners for more than 6 years. And we did find that for grades where students were at risk or long-term English learners or LTELs, it is slightly higher in 2023 compared to the pre-pandemic year in 2019. And why is all of this important? Well, LTELs receive a lot of policy attention because being a long-term English learner is often associated with worse academic outcomes, including lower standardized test scores in English and math, as well as lower graduation rates. And some this might be driven by compositional group differences too, because LTELs are more than twice as likely than non-LTELs to have a disability. And also LTELs are slightly more likely to be socioeconomically disadvantaged compared to non-LTEL English learners. And so the question remains is, how can we both mitigate the number of at-risk students as well as provide support for the existing long-term English learners in our system? And so we were trying to get at this question a little bit with our interviews. And to address that first part, many districts said that this process starts early on. One district had indicated that students need more academic oral language development, especially when they're younger. So now they're investing in programs like the Sobrato Early Academic Language or the SEAL program in order to create these really content and language rich environments for younger students to practice their English. There are also some districts really emphasize the fact that there needs to be a better pedagogical system of instruction in these English language development courses. Some districts mentioned that their teachers are all creating their own different lesson plans. And so that leaves a lot of inconsistencies in instruction. And in that particular district, they said that their inexperienced teachers were often assigned to these ELD classrooms, but when they gain more experience, they transfer out and they leave these classrooms to the next group of new hires. So it really makes it's really important that these ELD programs are staffed with a consistent set of teachers and also a standard set of instruction, in order to create a really intense and effective learning environment for these students. And then when it comes to helping current LTELs, one district really emphasized having more tailored and intensive ELD courses for LTELs that are different from those traditional ELD courses early on. But this also means that districts need to be supporting their teachers as well to allow them to provide that effective instruction. And then finally, it's very common for LTELs to just feel very burnt out or disengaged, especially if they've been in that system for that long. And so some districts have really tried to implement new hands-on and practical approaches to better educate their LTELs. And so sometimes this looks like integrating arts into their English language development programs or adding career and technical pathways in their programming. And then finally, one thing that's really useful now is that the California School Dashboard is now tracking LTEL status and outcomes at the district level. So districts can now begin to trace how their LTELs are doing over time. And so, as I mentioned, the share of students who were LTEL did increase slightly due to the drops in reclassification during the pandemic. But Laura, maybe you can just talk to us a little bit more about why we saw such big declines in reclassification rates, especially during that time.
Definitely. Two main things. First was the difficulty in administering assessments. And the second was just priorities for faculty, for teachers and staff. So when it comes to the difficulty of the assessments, probably anyone with a child will remember that the Smarter Balance, which is the statewide assessment given to children every spring, just wasn't administered in 2020 or in 2021. And in many districts, that's a key component of a reclassification decision. So that assessment didn't exist. Some districts pivoted and had other tools, but when instruction was remote, it was difficult to get results for these assessments and take time to administer them. Same thing with the other assessment that's used to both identify English learners and measure progress annually, the LPAC. Um, at the beginning of the pandemic, it wasn't available remotely, so a student would have had to have been in person in order to take that assessment. And that definitely did not happen for, say, the 2021 school year in many cases. And you can see that in the data. When you look at the publicly available data, you can see that there's a very high proportion of children who had English language status that was TBD, like 15%. And in a typical year, that's less than 1%. So it was just challenging to administer these assessments, even when they did become available online. So that just meant that many of the tools that were usually used to reclassify just didn't exist during that time period. And then when schools did reopen and bring their students back, we heard from the folks that we spoke to at the districts that there were just so many other more pressing issues, like reconnecting with students and seeing where they were and helping them make progress and make up for lost time, so that it was not the first priority. And you can definitely see that in our estimated data. Those first 2 years, the reclassification rates were low, and then they started to bounce back. And now, in any current year, it looks like we're recovered to the level where we were before. So, thanks for engaging in this key takeaways conversation with me beyond. We got to talk a little bit more in depth about some of the things that we wanted to pass along to our audience. Now it is time for us to move to questions and from the audience, so we can take a few here. Just to remind folks that if you do have a question for us, please email it to ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. And it looks like we have a first question from Elk Grove. And the question is, so is there still a teacher shortage of bilingual educators given the fact that you're seeing enrollment declines when it comes to English learners?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, So I'll start off by first saying that we didn't really explicitly measure teacher shortage in our report, but we did hear a lot about these types of issues from the district interviews that we were doing. And you might think that now, because there are less students, the teachers might have less of a burden on their backs to provide that instruction. But despite these enrollment declines, from what we've heard that there hasn't been much of a lift of this burden on the staffing issue. There's also, from that map that I showed earlier, there are still pockets of California that did have enrollment growth over this time period. And so there definitely is more English learners in some regions of the state where that puts a lot more burden on staffing. But for the remainder part of the state where it is declining, the main issue that comes with the teaching staffing is having the credentialed teachers. And so I think a lot of districts are now struggling with having the right certifications for teachers to be teaching these ELD classes. And I think we heard from one district who said that for their whole entire district, they only had one teacher on special assignment, and then they had to go take a specialized course, and then they had to come back and then give that professional development to all the other teachers in the state. So obviously, this causes a lot of delays and lags, and so that causes a lot of backup in terms of how they're providing that instruction to their students. And so even with less students, like less English learners in the system, I think there still is a lot of work on the actual certification part for staffing in order to really provide the adequate support for English learners.
Thanks, Bian. And then there's a follow-up question from someone in Los Angeles that asks a question you've at least partially addressed about variation by region, but is there a little more you could add about that?
Yeah, so I'll just say that we did talk to a variety of districts from across the state. Some were rural districts and some were big city districts. So we did get to hear, stories from different sides. And we've heard that the smaller districts are really struggling to find those credentialed teachers, as I mentioned. And I think they even say that, like, because we're from such a small town, it's really hard for them to even attract teachers to come to their city or to their district. Usually only people who are from that area usually come back and teach, but even then it's really hard for them to convince them to even come and teach there, right? And so that's one issue. I think rural districts do face more struggle in terms of the staffing issue. I think there's also a lot of bordering competition. So we did talk to a few smaller districts that did border a bigger district, and I think they often struggle with competing with those bigger districts when it comes to attracting those staff. And so I think in terms of the regional differences, I think uh, it's really important for, I think, future analyses to really focus on how can we best address the problems that are happening in rural and smaller districts in California as well.
Thanks, Beyond. And I'm sorry, I'm going to give you one more question. Maybe there'll be one for me soon, but this one I think is right up your alley. This audience member from Chico asks, how have academic outcomes from English learners changed over time? And I think in particular, they want to know if the pandemic had any negative impact on them.
Yes, for sure. There were definitely declines in academic performance for English learners. I think that time in general was just very hard for students to absorb information, and students in general were definitely struggling during the pandemic. But our study didn't really focus on particular English learner like academic outcomes. But in terms of like trajectories, we did see that there is increased language proficiency by the start of first grade. And so if you can recall that one figure of the cumulative growth, we see that there in the most recent district, so 2023 kindergarten cohort, there was an increase in terms of rates of reclassification for first grades. And so those are higher than ever. So that is at least telling us that like there is some hope in terms of initial reclassification, especially for these early first graders, that they are becoming a little bit more proficient earlier. But it's still about, catching up those uh, grades in the second to fifth grade that were especially impacted during the pandemic, especially since there was so much of that lag. Um, Laura, maybe you can also talk about how like the reclassified ELs, how their outcomes might have changed, especially during the pandemic. I'm not sure about like, for example, their English learner scores, if you have information about that, but I'm sure um, that was also very impacted as well.
Yes, I think it's sort of safe to say that nearly universally scores went down for students during the pandemic. I do think that reclassified students did less badly in relative to the English learners, and that's a pattern that's held over time that the state's reclassified students are among some of the best performing in the state. And definitely have higher test scores, of course, than English language learner students, in part because the reason they are reclassified is that they perform strongly on standardized tests, but they perform much better than English only students on average. And despite that, though, they did have some of the same struggles that all students had during the pandemic. Um, and I would love to talk. We got a question I missed the part of the state, but someone was interested in hearing a little bit more about your recommendation or our report recommendation about standardizing reclassification and what does that kind of mean. And I think there are a few things I'd just like to say about that real quick. First of all, districts have leeway in terms of following state guidance about reclassification recommendations, and many districts have different requirements from one another. So that means that it's not at all uniform in terms of what qualifies a student to be an English learner versus reclassified across the state. And that gives local control, but it might not make sense from the student's perspective. One thing that we heard about that districts were doing to help catch up reclassifying was automating, just taking some of this decision making out of not out of the hands of, but making it just more streamlined so that there wasn't so much work to do to figure out who was eligible for reclassification and to do it. And also having multiple opportunities for this to happen each year rather than saying, oh, it's in May. Just anytime there's a new assessment or a new tool that feeds into the decision, looking and seeing, is this student now ready? Because you can end up having one kind of score that qualifies you and another that doesn't in one year. And if you then manage to miss the window the next year when you have those things qualifying you, then you could miss out on the opportunity to reclassify. Um, and a few districts also told us about that some real targeting that they're doing, where they're taking a student that they know has met the criteria on something that is very difficult for most students, and then they give the student multiple opportunities to hit the target on the other parts of the reclassification decision. So that seems like something that's promising for districts to consider. And let's see, we have one more question in here. Um, Prioritizing the emotional well-being of students when we return to school makes sense for the first year. But given that we are 3 years removed from the pandemic, what explains the continuing low reclassification rates? I'll take that one. I think that what we are seeing in our estimates is actually that the reclassification rates have returned to the pre-pandemic level in any given year. So we're seeing in the most recent school year for which we calculated this estimate that about 13% of English learners are being reclassified, and that's similar to the rate before. But what has happened is not that the rates haven't recovered, but some students just kind of miss their window in some ways in the remote instruction period. So there are still some students out there who maybe would have been reclassified if the conditions had been standard, not remote instruction. But it is confusing when we're saying, the rates of return, but the cumulative share of students who've been reclassified has not caught up yet. But what we're saying is the actual annual rates have recovered. Some individual students may have missed their chance, and some districts are doing what they can or what they consider the best way forward to try to catch these students up. So I hope that answers the question. And then let's see. Looks like we have maybe one more question. Sorry for the delay here. Okay. We got a question from Bellflower. What's explaining the enrollment growth in the more inland districts and the regions in California? And I think, Beyond showed us that figure that shows kind of where this is happening. So just to reinvigorate that in everyone's mind, that is certainly the more the center of the state and the northern part of the state where we might have been seeing some more growth. And what we heard from districts was it's about the economics, it's just more affordable in those parts of the state. And certainly when we look at projections, we've done some work at PPIC to work with the Department of Finance projections, and it looks like what pattern we've already seen is more or less going to continue, that the areas of the state that are going to see growth will be the northern Central Valley and the Sierra region. And that likely it does have a lot to do with affordability of housing and jobs and things like that. So that's our best guess about that. And I believe that's our last question. So I want to just say thank you so much, Beyond, for your presentation. Even though I'm a co-author on the report, I still found it super interesting. It was a great summary of what we did. And thanks so much for joining me in this discussion. And I also want to thank our funders, the Sobrato Family Foundation. And thanks so much to all of you for joining us online. We would very much appreciate if you could take a moment to give us your feedback after the event. If you happen to register beforehand, you'll get an email later today. And if not, you can take a picture of this QR code right here and send us your survey result. We'd really appreciate it. Then just also to let you know that there will be a recording of today's event available on the PPIC website and also on the YouTube channel. So feel free to share it with your friends and family. And you can also rewatch it again. And we're happy to have you do that and check out what we had to say. And thank you so much again for joining us. Hope you have a great rest of your day.